FBI agent Kieran Ramsey.
Kieran, it's nice to see you. Thank you very much for joining me. I've been looking into this Nolan Wells story all day, really. It's a really sad story. I mean, it seemed like this kid just had such a bright future, and everybody seemed to have amazing things to say about him. I wanted to ask you first, Ben Crump, the family attorney, said that there's going to be sort of this dual investigation with the phone, that they're going to have the, officials looking into it, the police, but then also they have experts that the family's hiring that's going to be looking at the phone, I guess at the same time. Have you ever heard of this happening this way?
Look, it's an unusual track to see happening in real time like this. It's certainly not common. I think it speaks to why there is a need for law enforcement to immediately seize digital devices, image those, and start that examination immediately.
Hey,
Given the fact that the family and the attorney are doing this, perhaps that's going to lend some additional integrity to the investigation so that there isn't one single source of information, which admittedly in the public space is already facing some intense scrutiny. So again, it's unusual. It's not the typical standard process that you would see. But in the end, as long as law enforcement is able to do what they need to do for evidentiary purposes, that they can establish that chain of custody and be able to detail any forensic examination so that if it's ever needed to be presented in court, there won't be any question as to the integrity of the information or the data that is able to be extracted from it.
It seems the mom or the parents had the phone. Is that unusual to you? Because I guess with most of the cases I've covered, the phone will go into like the police evidence.
Look, I'll put it this way. These were clearly desperate parents just trying to find their son.
Mm.
I can't put it past them in that regard. I'm a dad of two teenage boys. Even though I'm former FBI, I can't blame them for that. But admittedly, a forensic image should have been taken of that phone first by law enforcement immediately. However, given the circumstances by which they had to go find the phone themselves, again, it's hard for me to take major umbrage with it, given that they're desperate parents and they had to go find the phone themselves. But ideally, in normal cases, yeah, you want law enforcement to seize that phone first, start a chain of custody, image that phone so that the integrity of the evidence that's found is unquestionable.
When law enforcement gets a phone in a situation like this, and we don't know if it's an iPhone, but what do they do? What kind of information can they pull off of it?
So I think I've seen a lot of reports that the Snapchat account was deleted, which would have been
Mm.
unusual for this young man. Look, deleted is never deleted. And for law enforcement, and particularly now with the FBI's involvement and their digital forensics capabilities, and admittedly, I don't know what Jackson County's digital forensics capabilities are. I do know what the FBI's are. So that aspect of being deleted is never really truly deleted. So you have several layers of recoverable data that exists. So you have data on the Snapchat servers, so servers data from the servers. You have metadata. And both of those can be gained from preservation letters and subpoenas. On top of that, you have geolocation data from both the handsets and maps according to the Snapchat account. Again, if you know how Snapchat works, and unfortunately, my kids use Snapchat too. So you have that map aspect of it. Then again, another big piece, and I've seen it reported a lot, is the Life 360 data for that handset. So there's going to be that information. So when we think about the amount of information that they can gain from this phone, it's tremendous. But I'll emphasize this. While that phone is the centerpiece of the digital, let's call it the digital footprint of what investigators are going to be looking for, it doesn't end with just that handset. I believe we've already seen the Jackson County authorities come out and try to crowdsource information and say, look, if you were on, I believe it's Horn Island that day, we want any phones or any photos, any video, nothing edited. We want to make sure we know who was there. So if you were there, please let us know so that they can do all that, because then you have cell tower dumps as well. So for the geolocation data for the cell towers themselves. And every single device, as well as every single person that was on that island that day, then becomes a potential witness or a potential evidentiary lead.
How do the other people with cell phones, could they help determine his location and through the towers? Is that what you're saying?
No, so the towers are going to put who was ever on that island at that time, the
Okay.
geolocation data for any of the handsets that were on that. And then yes, you are going to have time and space proximity of certain handsets. So by way of example, if you and I are on the island and you go off, yet I tell the authorities, no, you and I were there together the entire time, but the cell tower dumps show that nope, your handset was gone, it left. Okay, then that opens up a line of inquiry, right? Really an investigative lead. I think they're going to be looking at a lot of that given the circumstances as described, because you have a timeline that has a lot of contradictions, right? You have this group of friends that's there with him saying they departed, that he was going to stay behind to, I believe, talk with some girl. The girl then comes out and says, no, we talked, but then he was leaving to go catch up with his friends. Then somebody else shifts the timeline as to when those friends left. And then we have the handset itself. The Life 360 data shows that the handset's back apparently on the mainland.
That's right.
From what I saw in open source reporting, while they're claiming, no, he's still on the island. So again, there's a lot of inconsistencies. Each one of those, that timeline doesn't close. It actually breaks up contradictions, and each one leads to an investigative pursuit that can be followed.
This is the story of Nolan Wells and the deepening mystery surrounding his death. If this is your first time here, welcome to Samuel Vale Crime Chronicles, where we dig deep into the cases that demand answers. If this story moves you, if you believe that cases like this deserve the attention they deserve, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means everything, and it helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. Nolan Wells grew up in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a small, tight-knit coastal community where people know each other's names and children grow up under the watchful eyes of their neighbors. He attended Ocean Springs High School, where he distinguished himself not only on the athletic field, but in the lives of the people around him. Those who knew him describe him the same way, over and over again. A good kid, a hard worker, someone who made the people around him better just by being present. By the time the summer of his death arrived, Nolan was a rising sophomore at Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he was a member of the football team. He was a multi-sport athlete, a young man whose physical gifts were matched by his dedication and character. The week after July 4th, he was scheduled to begin an athletic training program, the next step in what everyone around him believed would be a remarkable future. The morning of July 4th began the way many summer days do along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, with sunshine, boats, and the anticipation of a holiday on the water. Nolan joined a group of friends for a boat trip to Horn Island, a remote, uninhabited barrier island that is part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. The island sits off the Mississippi coast, accessible only by boat, and on Independence Day, it draws crowds of people looking to celebrate away from the mainland. GPS tracking data obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources tells us precisely how that morning unfolded. The vessel carrying Nolan and his group departed from a dock on the mainland at approximately 9:56 in the morning. It arrived at Horn Island at roughly 11:14 that same morning. The group spent hours on the island, and then, at 4:31 in the afternoon, the boat departed Horn Island and returned to the original dock where the journey had begun. Nolan Wells was not on that boat. According to his friends, Nolan had chosen to stay behind. One of those friends, a young man named Trayston Shepard, told ABC News that during the time they spent on the island, Nolan had met a young woman. Shepard said the two had only just met, that it was their first time spending any time together, and that Nolan had told his friends he would find another ride back to shore. Shepard maintained that the group had done nothing wrong, saying publicly that they all cared about Nolan, and that no one wanted to see anything happen to him. But Nolan's family heard that explanation and rejected it. Not with anger, not with accusation, but with the quiet certainty of people who knew their son. His parents said clearly and repeatedly that Nolan would not have stayed on that island without his friends. They did not believe he would have willingly separated himself from the people he came with in a remote location with no clear way home. They said so from the very beginning. And the more the facts came to light, the more their skepticism appeared warranted. The young woman Nolan allegedly stayed behind for told a different story. According to reporting on her account, she confirmed that she and Nolan had spoken on the island. But she said that after their conversation, Nolan left, that he was heading back to catch up with his friends. Her account directly contradicted the narrative offered by Shepard and the group. According to her, Nolan was not choosing to remain on the island. He was leaving. He was heading toward the people who were, at that very moment, getting on a boat to go home without him. Two stories, two irreconcilable versions of the same afternoon, and somewhere between those two accounts, an 18-year-old boy lost his life. The search for Nolan Wells began after he failed to return home. The remote nature of Horn Island complicated efforts to locate him quickly. 2 days after July 4th, Nolan's body was discovered near the island. It was found by a National Park Service ranger, a detail that would later have significant implications for which agencies would become involved in the investigation. The grief that followed was immediate and immeasurable. A family had lost a son. A community had lost one of its brightest young people. And almost before that grief had time to settle, authorities made a statement that would ignite a firestorm of controversy. Law enforcement declared, in the early days after Nolan's body was found, that there was no indication of foul play. No autopsy had been completed. No toxicology results had been returned. No full investigative review had been conducted, and yet the declaration was made, a premature characterization of a young man's death that struck many observers, including former federal investigators, as a serious procedural failure. Retired FBI agent Ramsey, speaking publicly on the case, described the move plainly. He said, "You simply cannot characterize cause and manner of death before an autopsy and before toxicology. That doing so is contrary to standard law enforcement protocol." He called it a sequencing error, and he said that by making that declaration prematurely, authorities had brought a wave of intense scrutiny upon themselves that could and should have been avoided. The damage to public trust was immediate, and for a family already in anguish, it deepened the wound. As of the time of this reporting, no official cause of death has been publicly released. The official autopsy results remain pending. A private, independent autopsy is being conducted separately in Washington, D.C., funded by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, whose involvement reflected the national attention the case had attracted. Tyler Perry, the filmmaker and actor, stepped forward to cover Nolan's funeral expenses. The involvement of these public figures was a signal, not just of sympathy, but of a collective demand for transparency and accountability that had taken root far beyond the borders of Mississippi. The family retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump to represent them. Crump, who has represented families in some of the most high-profile cases involving the deaths of Black Americans in recent years, took the case and immediately began pressing for answers. He was joined by attorney Eric Hertz, who led the family's independent investigative team, a group that included former federal law enforcement agents with the expertise to examine the evidence the family believed was being overlooked. After the family and their legal team met with the district attorney, Crump emerged with two significant pieces of information. The first was that the district attorney had committed to turning the case over to a grand jury once the investigation was complete and all relevant information had been gathered. The second was an agreement regarding Nolan's cell phone. The phone is at the center of everything. It was found on the boat, not with Nolan on the island. On the boat, with the friends who came back without him. Some of those friends offered an explanation, that it was common practice to leave phones on the boat to keep them from getting wet. That may be true for some people in some situations, but Nolan's family said that was not like their son. They said he was constantly active on social media, particularly on Snapchat, and that for his phone to have been silent and away from him for an entire day was profoundly out of character. What made the situation more troubling was what the family found, or rather, didn't find, when they finally obtained the phone. Nolan's Snapchat account had been deleted, an account that, according to his family, he used regularly and actively, showed no activity for the entire day of July 4th, and had subsequently been removed. Retired FBI agent Ramsey addressed this directly, calling the combination of the deleted account and the day-long silence on the platform possible indicators of evidence spoliation, a term that refers to the deliberate destruction or concealment of evidence. He was careful to note that nothing had been confirmed, but he was equally clear that these were data points that required serious investigative attention. Because in his words, deleted is never truly deleted. Law enforcement, particularly the FBI with its digital forensics capabilities, has tools and legal mechanisms to recover data that users believe has been permanently erased. Then there was the Life 360 data. Life 360 is a location sharing application. According to open source reporting on the case, Life 360 data from Nolan's phone indicated that the handset was back on the mainland while friends were still claiming Nolan was on the island. That contradiction between what the digital data showed and what witnesses were saying is the kind of inconsistency that investigators describe as an investigative lead. It doesn't close the timeline, it breaks it open. The phone itself was not immediately surrendered to law enforcement. According to reporting on the case, the family had to go and retrieve it themselves. It was not willingly handed over. That detail alone raised questions. In any investigation involving a missing or deceased person, digital devices represent a critical category of evidence. The standard protocol is for law enforcement to seize those devices immediately, create a forensic image to preserve the integrity of the data, and establish a clear chain of custody so that any findings can withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. That did not happen here. By the time the phone came into focus as a key piece of evidence, it had already passed through multiple hands. The chain of custody that forensic investigators rely on had already been compromised, not through malice on the family's part, but through a failure of the initial investigative response. Ben Crump announced that the solution agreed upon was a mutual inspection, meaning the phone would be examined jointly by official investigators, including the sheriff's office and the FBI, and simultaneously by the family's own independent experts. Retired FBI agent Ramsey acknowledged this was an unusual arrangement, not the standard process, but suggested it could ultimately serve to strengthen the integrity of the investigation by ensuring there was no single unchecked source of information. If the results were going to be challenged, having multiple expert eyes on the same data would make the findings harder to dispute. The FBI's involvement in the case was formalized following the discovery of Nolan's body. Because Horn Island is part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, it falls under federal jurisdiction. The body was found by a National Park Service ranger, which further anchored the case in federal territory. Jackson County appears to remain the lead agency in the investigation, with the FBI operating alongside them, a collaborative arrangement that law enforcement agencies in the Gulf Coast region are accustomed to navigating. The FBI's presence does not, by itself, indicate that a crime has been determined to have occurred. Federal jurisdiction over the land and the Bureau's superior digital forensics capabilities both provided independent reasons for their involvement, but their participation does mean that the investigation has access to resources and expertise far beyond what a local sheriff's office could deploy on its own. That includes the ability to serve preservation letters to platforms like Snapchat, issue grand jury subpoenas for server-side data, conduct cell tower analysis, and process forensic images of digital devices with a level of sophistication that leaves very little truly hidden. The cell tower dimension of this investigation is significant in ways that extend far beyond Nolan's phone alone. Every mobile device that was present on Horn Island on July 4th produced data. That data, captured by cell towers serving the area, can establish which devices were on the island, how long they were there, and when they left. It can establish time and space proximity between devices, meaning investigators can determine whether people were together or separated at specific moments in time. If a witness claims to have been with Nolan at a certain hour, but cell tower data shows their device was already miles away, that contradiction becomes an investigative thread that cannot be ignored. Attorney Eric Hertz stated publicly that the family's team was receiving dozens of calls every day from people who had been on Horn Island on July 4th. He said witnesses were coming forward with information, what they saw, what they knew, what they heard. He also noted, with evident concern, that some of those individuals were speaking to the family's investigators, but not to law enforcement. He expressed the hope that those witnesses could be encouraged to cooperate with official investigators because the family's goal was not to conduct a parallel proceeding. It was to ensure that all relevant evidence reached the grand jury. Hertz also referenced what he called a false narrative, a characterization of events that the family's team believed needed to be corrected. When pressed for specifics, he did not elaborate. But the statement itself was pointed. It suggested that the account being presented publicly, the account offered by Nolan's friends, contained elements that the family's independent investigation had reason to question. Jackson County authorities made their own appeal to the public, asking anyone who had been on Horn Island on the 4th of July to come forward with photographs, videos, and personal accounts, all unedited. The request reflected a clear investigative awareness that the events of that day had unfolded in the presence of hundreds of people, many of whom were capturing moments on their phones. Every image, every video, every piece of metadata attached to those files represents a potential data point that can help fill in the gaps of a timeline that, right now, has too many gaps to close. There was also audio. Shortly before the time of this reporting, audio emerged that appeared to capture a radio communication from the boat during its return trip to the mainland, the trip on which Nolan was not present. The audio reportedly contained the group calling for towing assistance, indicating the boat was experiencing mechanical issues or taking on water. Retired FBI agent Ramsey noted that if verified, this audio would contribute meaningfully to the reconstruction of that day's timeline, helping investigators establish who was where and when, relative to when Nolan was last known to be alive. Every piece of verified evidence is a thread, and in a case this complex, with this many contradictions, with witnesses whose accounts diverge at critical moments and digital data that appears to conflict with the narrative on the record, the threads matter. The timeline has not closed. The truth has not emerged. But the investigation continues, and the tools available to those conducting it are formidable. Nolan Wells had everything ahead of him. He was 18 years old, a college athlete, a young man beloved by his family and community, set to begin an athletic training program the week after the trip that ended his life. His parents knew him. They knew his habits, his character, his patterns of behavior, and from the very beginning, they said that the story being told about their son did not sound like the young man they raised. A grand jury has been promised. An independent autopsy is underway. The cell phone, the device that may have recorded, in digital silence, exactly what happened on Horn Island on July 4th, is now the subject of a forensic examination that could shift the course of this entire investigation. Toxicology results, when they come, may answer questions that witnesses have not been able or willing to answer honestly. Cell tower data may place people in locations that contradict their own statements, and the dozens of witnesses who were on that island, who saw something, heard something, knew something, will have to decide whether they are willing to tell the truth. Nolan Wells deserves the truth. His family deserves the truth. And the only way that truth emerges is if the evidence is followed wherever it leads, regardless of who it implicates, and regardless of how uncomfortable it makes those whose stories haven't held together from the start. This case is not closed. The investigation is ongoing. The questions are real, and the family of Nolan Wells is not going away until answers come. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that cases like this deserve the scrutiny and the dedication they demand, then please show your support right now. Like this video and subscribe to Samuel Vale Crime Chronicles. Every like, every subscription tells the algorithm that these stories matter, and it helps ensure that cases like Nolan's reach the audience they deserve. Stay with this channel, because as this investigation develops, there is more to come. The truth about what happened on Horn Island on July 4th has not yet been fully told, but we will be here when it is.